Hello and welcome to another episode of the Religious Studies Project. I'm Bree Fallon, and with me is
Dave McConaughey, fresh amid the election here in the United States, where we're still anxiously waiting for all the votes to be counted. I have bitten all my nails. I have chewed on my lip. I have drunk all the coffee to stay awake to hear the results, but they're still not in. And so the Religious Studies podcasts just continue marching on as they do when you have a global international podcast. Isn't that right, Brie?
That is right, and I must say I am very thankful for your insight, Dave, as somebody on the ground there, so that I have a little bit more information than just what I am getting from the news in Australia here. So thank you very much for that. And speaking of things that we should be thankful for, we have a wonderful bit of a theory-heavy episode coming up for you this week. What do we have, Dave?
Yeah, we have an episode by David G. Robertson called Rhizomes, Assemblages, and Religious Change with Paul-Francois Tremlett. Take it away.
I'm David Robertson, and today I am very pleased to be joined by Paul-Francois Tremlett, my colleague and until recently boss at the university. But we're not here to talk about my employment record today. Instead, we're going to be talking about Paul's new book, Towards a New Theory of Religious and Social Change, Sovereignties and Disruptions, which is published by Bloomsbury. So welcome back to the Religious Studies Project, Paul.
Very pleased to be here, David. Very pleased indeed.
And we're very, very pleased to have you. And in some ways, I think this interview will follow on quite nicely from your first one, talking about Lévi-Strauss and an engagement with cutting edge and classic sociological theories of religion, society, and change. In fact, that might be a good place to start the interview. This new book really jumps off a discussion on some patterns of models of religious change, if that makes sense. Some different traditions and lineages of models of social change in the study of religion that we're probably all pretty familiar with. But maybe you could set out these different traditions and some of the problems with them.
Yeah, love to. So I was interested in change. We live in a rapidly changing world, and a lot of things going on out there that are quite disturbing and let's face it, terrifying. So change is something we're always trying to understand. And I was also interested, of course, in not just in change on the global scale, but social change in the UK, and then more in discipline specific, how we think about change in religious studies and the kind of theories that we have been working with. And, alongside that, of course, is the tendency to represent religions themselves as rather static, monolithic entities, which are, as it were, immune to change. So the question of change really became quite important to me. And I was quite dissatisfied with the theories of change that we have. We have the secularization thesis, which is a unilinear sort of teleological theory of progress, whereby religion declines as scientific rationalism becomes more pervasive in modernizing societies. And we have the live religion thesis, which is a very different way of thinking about change. It focuses very much on the way people create religious or religious assemblages or religious new forms of religious practice out of the sort of bric-a-brac of religion and culture as they find it in their ordinary lives. So secularization thesis is a very sort of macro theory of change, and there are many, many critiques which we don't need to go over here. But and then there's the live religion thesis, which is a very sort of micro-ethnographic theory of religious and cultural assembly and change, which is very popular in the discipline at the moment. But again, I felt that there was room to try and think somewhat differently about change. And what I wanted to do was to do something a little bit different. I wanted to be less anthropocentric. I wanted to decenter. I wanted to center the human subject. I wanted to think about religion without recourse to meaning, without recourse to belief, without recourse to rationality. And I wanted to foreground other entities so that the account of change that would emerge would be one in which humans and a range of other actors would be operating, as it were, on a flat ontological plane in which they're all having a role in how religions and societies change together. And a very simple example that we're all extremely familiar with. You cannot think about the Reformation, or maybe you can think about the Reformation without printing, but I would argue that you should not think about the Reformation without thinking about the role of the technology of printing, which revolutionizes the transmission of information in Europe in the 16th century. And that has a huge role in the changes that we would otherwise pin on Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and others.
So in a sense, we're moving away from a sort of history of great men, but more than that, it's a moving away from a history of religion in which people are the center of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to see what it would be like to try. I mean, in a way, the book was an experiment. Can I write an account in which meaning and belief are not really playing much of a role? And so I wanted to focus much more on technologies, cities, mountains, ghosts, these kinds of entities I wanted to give attention to, rather than, as you say, great men, great man theory, both in our sort of way we write academic histories of our discipline, but also in the way histories of change are constructed, have been given far too much agency, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it's not only sort of great men, but it's little people as well. It's the because the lived religion paradigm kind of flips it around and does it the other way. So we're looking at these choices being made by previously ignored groups. It's often sort of groups of women in the periphery and unofficial forms of religion and these kind of ideas, but those are all still based in kind of people and their in some way rational choice, right? But this model seems to completely decenter that into something which is much more about kind of connections and little networks of ideas. Am I understanding?
You are. I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy for what Live Religion Thesis is trying to do, because, as you say, it's trying to explore often ignored populations or elided populations, and the kind of religious praxis that they've been going about in ordinary life that's been ignored and just not written. It's not part of the official or orthodox religious and social histories that we're used to. So Live Religion offers a really potent antidote to some of that. But at the same time, it relies on a notion of the subject that is, for me anyway, or at least for this book, too phenomenologically authentic, too heroic, and at the same time, too neoliberal, right? Because what neoliberalism is all about, the emphasis is always on that heroic, authentic subject in a process of continuous reinvention and self-invention. And the Live Religion Thesis is really embedded in that. So part of this was also trying to get away from that, and the way that I chose to enact that was through starting to read the works of Deleuze and Guattari, which I suppose was a natural progression for me, given my interest in the work of Levi-Strauss, and which is also, as it were, an anti-humanist approach in many respects. So I wanted to, and I was also discovering a range of other authors, Jane Bennett and her work on her interest in vitalism, for example, Manuel de Landa, and a range of other authors who I felt were really offering a new way of thinking about the role of non-human actors in religious and social lives.
I'd like to maybe dig a little bit more into, Deleuze and Guattari, maybe specifically Jane Bennett's not a scholar I was familiar with until I read your book. But maybe before we get there, just before we leave kind of classical theory, there's a couple of interesting engagements, actually. You draw on Durkheim quite a lot, which I think is fascinating because he's the only scholar kind of from that era that I ever sort of use now. But there's also a lot of these scholars are using terminology that I associate with 19th century anthropology. So we're talking about vitalism, we're talking about animism, we're talking
fetishism.
There's other, fetishism. There's a lot of this terminology coming back. What is this playing with? It's at once a rejection of that kind of Victorian view, but there's a deturnment as well, if I can use situationist terms.
Well, yes, okay. Any reference to Guy Debord and the situationist is gratefully received, because, well, he was right, wasn't he? But, back to the subject in question. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a really interesting turn that's going on. We find, I think it was in a book by Apadurai, where he talked about methodological fetishism. Guattari talking about animist subjectivity, and a few other instances where this language, as you say, this language of the 19th century religious studies or anthropology of religion suddenly finding its way into contemporary theory. And it's and of course it's also there in the work of Bruno Latour, who says we have to, sociology has to rethink its approach to the non-human. It has to accept I think his words are a certain dose. Well, they're not his words because he was writing in French, but a certain dose of fetishism. So there is this appropriation of that terminology, of that language, as a means to try and understand again where we are. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning David Graeber. He's also part of this. David Graeber, who sadly died recently. He's also part of this move to explore what we can get out of thinking about objects and thinking and things and reappraising our relationship with materiality, to rethink things like creativity. He was also interested in concepts like fetishism and wrote about that in really interesting ways. I think it's an interesting move, and I think it's because there's been there are various turns and appropriations going on across different disciplines and disciplinary fields. But I think if we wanted to try and capture that or summarize it in some way, it would be that we're decentering ourselves, the human, from the way we understand the world. That doesn't mean we replace a metaphysics of the subject with a metaphysics of something else, but it does mean we must start to think about other agencies. There used to be something in the 80s when people were interested in chaos theory, a butterfly wings flutter in South America, and there's some other event happen somewhere else, and that was, that moment where people starting to think about our old understandings of, or our simple understandings of cause and effect are just not sufficient. They're just not satisfactory. We need to put complexity first, and understand that causes and effects are multiple, can work in ways that are counterintuitive. They're not always unidirectional, effects following causes, and so forth. And we need to really be prepared to make our lives more difficult as we try and theorize processes of change and transformation. So another thing that inspired me in this was Lévi-Strauss and his work on myth. Lévi-Strauss places the agency of myth in the myths themselves, and they change. They don't. Each new version is slightly different from the previous one, and there's this constant process of iterative change. The problem, if you like, with Lévi-Strauss's approach is that he's tied to a particular sort of teleology, which is entropic. So the myths will eventually just disintegrate and fall apart. I think it's important to avoid any teleologies, whether they're imagining progress or decline, and to try and think a little bit differently, rather than getting enamored of stories of progress or decline, to try and imagine a sort of flat ontology in which there's that potential for everything to be involved, have agency, and be involved in how things are working out, how things are going to change and transform.
It reminds me of Bourdieu. So the idea of the structuring structure. I think of all of the kind of, I know he's a little later than the classical kind of theorists that we've mostly been talking about, but in his work, you have this idea where let's continue with the idea of the myth from Lévi-Strauss. The structure has a certain agency on the agents, but the agents also affect the overall structure. So both are shaping each other in a kind of dialectic. Now, Durkheim probably also has some degree of that kind of teleological trajectory in his work, but I think it was something that your book reminded me of, and I don't know if you actually talk about Bourdieu at all.
Bourdieu's just, I know Bourdieu has quite a lot of currency, and it never happened. Me and Bourdieu never clicked. That's not to say I don't recognize he's made an important contribution to sociology and of religion as well. But I think I didn't talk about Durkheim in responding to your question, even though you'd sort of centered him as somebody I should. And Durkheim is a really interesting character. There's the person you read about as an undergraduate, maybe sort of, day one theory of religion course, and he's often quite conservative there, sort of this sort of positivistic sociology, social facts, and it's all about norms and rules. But there's another Durkheim. There's the Durkheim of the elementary forms, the Durkheim of effervescence, where there's a sort of release in the totemic ritual of energy that animates people and things, the totemic objects, and that's been important to a lot of people who are often unremembered in sociology, like Bataille, for example. That idea of this. Durkheim's idea of the sacred, mobilizing other accounts of the social in ways that we often overlook in religious studies. So Durkheim has a more radical angle that's quite interesting, and I was quite attracted to that.
And for your book, there's a specific interesting aspect, which is that Durkheim's theory kind of straddles religion and things that we normally think about as being political or even completely, like sport and things like that are just aspects of social life, but much more broadly. And that's one of the points that you make in the book, is that, the religious change is actually an aspect of much larger social dynamics and these broader networks of the social assemblages. I wondered maybe if it's time that we jump into maybe a more specific example, a kind of case study from one of the ones in the book, and how where these ideas that we've been exploring, how they occurred to you and how they work in practice.
So there's a couple of examples, and I'm just going to talk about the example from the Philippines, which is really about cities. So central to Spanish evangelization of the archipelago was the Law of the Indies, which mandated the construction of towns and cities and the construction of Manila, obviously, across the country. And evangelization would occur from these spaces that would then be linked by an increasingly complex network of roads and other forms of communication. So that establishment of ecclesiastical and colonial power through city building is, still evident when you go to Filipino towns and cities today, except that the plaza, which is in front of the church and around which the houses of the most important people were built and where they lived, those are no longer the centers of any contemporary Filipino towns. Now the center is somewhere else. It's maybe in the mall, or maybe in a new subdivision that's being built, or a new gated community, but probably the mall. And that reflects a series of transformations, not just in the architecture of towns or town planning, but also it reflects a change in the transmission of religion, the transmission and practice of religion. So if we look at what's very popular today in the Philippines is a Catholic charismatic group called El Shaddai. And El Shaddai became popular in the 90s and has continued to grow ever since. And what they've been very good at is using media, radio, television, social media. They built a mega church around 2009 on the outskirts of Manila, Metro Manila. And so what El Shaddai do is they have worked, they do a number of things by broadcasting the message comes into the home, and people heal through the television in their own homes and in their little chapter groups. They also hold mass rallies in the main park, the Luneta, near the Luneta Park in Manila, and now they also have their new mega church. The point is, the center of gravity of El Shaddai is completely different to the center of gravity of the traditional Catholic Church. The parish church, with its local population, very much grounded in a particular locality, transmission via the priest, is completely blown away by El Shaddai, which is not only connecting people, through all these different forms of media across the archipelago, but also abroad. As many people know, the main or primary export of the Philippines is Filipinos who work abroad in numerous capacities, nurses, carers, and so on and so forth. So these people are also plugged in to these virtual and online networks of El Shaddai worshippers and followers. So El Shaddai is creating a completely different kind of community, and thereby creating completely different kind of social and urban spaces. And so what I do in the book is I've given you the beginning and the end, as it were, of the transformation of Filipino sort of urban space. What I try and do in one of the chapters in the book is talk about what I call generative interactivity, where these different spaces are interacting with different forces and are kaleidoscopically, like the turn of a kaleidoscope, changing into new forms, on and on. So rather than focusing on the leader of El Shaddai, or the prosperity gospel, or these new ideas, or a theological angle through which to plot religious change from sort of traditional Catholicism to the prosperity gospel, what I'm interested in is rather the material forces through which El Shaddai is embedded in a series of other transformations, such as, for example, new forms of transport in the capital, or the building of malls, and so on and so forth. So it's really about trying to understand change as something that's rhizomatic, as something that's about us. It's about understanding change as an assemblage of forces and elements that are always moving, and it's through that process of emotion that new assemblages come into being.
And that focus on constant change is really important, I think, and significant. You give an example earlier in the book where you mention the growth of how quickly the Catholic Church declined in 18th century France, and then this growth, this explosion almost of new forms of church, Church of Reason and all the rest of them. And as you point out, they were relatively short-lived, but it changed the religious field, if you like, the social field in France permanently after that. And that constant decentralization of any kind of forward motion narrative, or likewise any idea of decline, I think it is it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean the example from France is, we all have know a little bit about 1789 in France and the power of the Catholic Church, and what happens after the Revolution are these series of little experiments in other forms of religious performance and religious belonging from Robespierre and the cult of reason to Saint-Simon and his religion of Newton, and Comte and his religion of humanity. Now, none of these things really take hold, although bizarrely or strangely, Comte had quite a big influence in Brazil. His Order and Progress is actually written into the Brazilian national flag. They don't obtain any sort of significant gravity of themselves, but they do change the gravity of France, and so French society today, and French Catholicism and the sort of religious topography of France is altered as a result of these experiments.
Let's wrap up then with a look at the three methodological principles that you suggest towards the end of the book, or methodological procedures rather, which are methodological animism and fetishism, assemblages, and change modelled as flows. How might we put these together, and what might an approach to studying religious change look like?
I think, it's there's a certain sort of egotism in trying to say this is how everybody should do things from now on, and perhaps I don't really mean that, but what I do think we should be doing is we should be thinking much. We should be looking to decenter ourselves from the stories we tell. Yeah, in our field of research and teaching, not because we're not important, but because there are a whole range of other actants out there that are shaping how we feel, how we do things, and what happens next. And once you've started to decenter us and started to think about these other actants, once you've started to think animistically or fetishistically, then it's almost a natural step to start to imagine assemblages of elements gravitating together, forming fields of organizing fields in which life is lived out at multiple scales, and that those assemblages are active and transformative. And once we start to get the idea of once we start to get that idea, we can start to imagine change as a constant rather than as something that's happening suddenly or incredibly incrementally. We need to imagine it as something that's always happening and not get. And there is one caveat to that. I think I say. Objects, plants, things, humans participating across a flat plane of interactions. I mean, there is one caveat to that. The idea of the flat plane of interaction is problematic. It's problematic because of course, there isn't perfect symmetry between all these different agencies. Power and politics are at work, and those create asymmetries. We need to take account of those asymmetries, and we need to understand them, because otherwise, and I talk about some of this as well. We can't understand how the world is gendered, how the world is racialized. These kinds of very, very important and powerful asymmetries need to be addressed. And I would. One of the critiques of a Deleuzean approach is that it doesn't take sufficient account of these of power. I think one of the things I try and do throughout the book is show that it can, and it does make a useful contribution to that.
I was going to ask, actually. You do. I do remember reading that aspect about power, but the other side of the kind of critical project is a focus on language. And I was kind of, when I was reading it at the beginning, you talked about these different models of social change, and there wasn't really, well, you didn't mention a sort of, a critical discursive model, perhaps. Maybe you just didn't think it was relevant, and that's fine. But how does then questions about, for instance, are we talking about religious change or social change? If things are largely made of discourse and of language, then how can they be agents? Maybe this is too big a question. I just want to get some idea of your thinking on this. Because it seems to me that the idea of religion is itself a kind of assemblage growing out of economic and scientific and theological concerns mostly in the colonial era, and developed later on. And so to talk about change of that in itself is maybe problematic, or am I just overcomplicating things here?
No, not at all. I think you're right. I think the term religion has a gravity, and that gravity has been obtained through some of the processes that you're alluding to. And for sure, that gravity compels teaching and research to take certain forms. And a lot of what's been happening over the last 20, 30 years is various people, Russell McCutcheon, Tal al-Assad, numerous others that ought to be mentioned, and I'm not going to for reasons of time and space, are trying to deflect that gravity, to move it, shift it, to bring new elements to the constellation, right? So I completely agree. I mean, I suppose what I would say is, well, maybe what you're talking about has been done and done in a very interesting way by Foucault in the archaeology. Because you're absolutely right. Discourses have power and they have agency, for sure.
It's not even necessarily a criticism. It's where my interest in the sort of critical discourse side of things runs into the kind of network thinking of Deleuze and Latour and things like that. That is the bit I've yet to get my head around, is where the two of those things, how they intersect and how they could work together. Because I do realize the limits of critique, and I'm trying to get past that, but that's the place where the disjunction is for me.
I think that's a really, I think the meeting point of Foucault and Deleuze is kind of interesting. There's Foucault's forward to capitalism and schizophrenia, and there are, I think, in control societies, Deleuze engages with discipline and punish, although it's not a very long piece, but he does engage with it in quite a significant way. But it seemed to me that they spent a lot of time not really engaging with each other's work or talking past each other to some extent. So maybe that work around discourse and this sort of anti-humanist, object-centered, Latourian stuff, Deleuzian stuff. Maybe that how those intersect and how they work together. That's a job that no one's done yet. Maybe. Now I'm probably exposing myself to. No, I've done it from a corner of the room, in which case I apologise if I'm revealing my ignorance somehow.
If you have, if you are, I am as well. So don't worry. I mean, and if you've done that work, listener, then please do get in touch.
Absolutely,
because I'd like to speak to you. Yeah, absolutely. That'll be the next episode. I mean, we're going to have to wrap up now, Paul. And I mean, obviously, we could, and probably will talk about this for hours more yet. But I think we've done a decent job of outlining where you are. So thank you again. And any last words or anything you want to plug or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, just thank you very much for having me, and stay safe, everybody.
Wise words. Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
If today's episode brought you back to graduate school with its conversations on Foucault and Deleuze and Bataille and Bourdieu, don't be afraid. It's okay. We all sometimes need the reminder that the work of theory really marches on. The conversation that Paul-Francois and David had today really focuses on the way that change works and what level should we understand how change works. Should we look for change at the macro level, at the global level, or should we look for change at the micro level? And in many people's opinions, that dichotomy between a kind of macro approach that's a kind of older theoretical model or the newer on the ground lived experienced model that looks at a more micro level, that both of those miss quite a bit about the way in which change operates. And so I'm really thankful that we can kind of talk about the asymmetry of power and the way that religious change can be theorized in so many different ways. If you're not familiar with the rhizomatic model, I hope that you learned some new things about this today. I know that I used some of my own theory on that with Durkheim in my dissertation, so I was familiar with the rhizomatic approach Deleuze and Guattari have presented. So if that's new to you, great, welcome to the world that we think about that. Bree, we're going to continue thinking about religious change going forward. There's a lot of changes that are happening in the next episode that's coming up. I know that I spoke about religious change. Can you say a little bit about the context in Australia that I was investigating in next time's episode?
Definitely. Next week, Dave spoke to Professor Christina Rolsher. She's the former president of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion. And We've been wanting to get Christina on the project for a really long time because she talks about transnational Pentecostal connections between Australia and Brazil, and particularly the Brazilian community in Australia. And she's actually received an ARC, an Australian Research Council postdoctoral fellowship on this topic. And it's an area that she has a lot of expertise in. So next week, our episode will be you, Dave, with Christina, and it is Global Flows, Local Contexts, Pentecostalism in Australia. So we will see you then. But until then, all that's left to say is
Thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR and the IAHR and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's the other guy. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox and Lauren Osborne, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, podcast transcription by Andy Alexander and Savannah Finver, and social media managed by Ray Radford and Candice Mixon.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our Amazon affiliate links or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.